because I like questions. So we're all here. Anybody not? 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, including myself. I'm down on the list, I think, speaking about walking the leys. Is that correct? Right, okay. Do you all know what a lay is? Who has heard of the term lay? Ah, right, so you know that. And who's a bit bemused because I'm not saying ley line? Because that's the first thing you've got to learn. The term is ley, L-E-Y. Anybody who says ley line is ignorant. Because it shows they, for one thing, they've never read the old straight track by Alfred Watkins. And if you go through it, you'll never see the term ley line. It's always lay. And by definition, a lay is a line. You don't need to say line, line. And we're going back, well, to 100 years ago in 1925, when a very respectable citizen of Hereford, he lived near the cathedral and was hobnobbing with a bishop, a great antiquarian. His family, his money was in brewing, and he used to go around with his on the old brewer's dray around the county of Herefordshire and into what we now call Powys, old Radnorshire, and selling his beer. And a great antiquarian and a photographer. He invented a light meter, and he's got a room to himself in the museum in Hereford. His name was Alfred Watkins. I think he was born in 1855, Victorian, and a very proper person, very highly respected. Not a weirdo, not like me. And he wrote a book. Well, go back 4 years before to 1921, 30th of June 1921. He had a revelation, a flash, a vision. He was at Blackwoodine Crossroads, which was between Hereford and Leinster, if you know that part of the marches, on his one of his expeditions, and he just saw in a flash a pattern of lines, of leys, through the landscape, formed by old standing stones and burial chambers, old barrows, mounds. The first chapter of the book, The Old Straight Track, is not about standing stones, it's about mounds, artificial hills or hillocks, and old churches, holy wells, particular trees, especially the Scots pine, and these would line up, and they'd often line up in the distance. You'd see a holy hill, and if you lined it up, if you took a compass out, you would realise it would be 50 degrees, for example, would be the rising of the sun at the summer solstice. Didn't have to be then, it could have been Beelzebub or May the 1st, or any of these things, but they're all of significance. And now this is, well, he was a Victorian, but you're talking about now the 1920s. And people were being rational, academic. You get these new schools of things like archaeology, and people would define things. They'd say, there's a Stone Age, there's a Bronze Age, and so forth, and categorize things. people who thought they knew what was what. They were professors at universities. They were proper people. So you didn't question them. This is when you have things like evolution, Darwin, and people who, some of those labels they gave are false. In fact, most of them, when you look into them, they're falling off because they could be totally false. One term I just mentioned now, going back to about 1700, you've heard about the Celts. Do you think we're Celtic? Do you think we here in this West Britain, at Penmaen Mawr, do you think this is Celtic land? Celtic fringe, they call it. Well, most people do. They blithely write about Celtic. The Celtic saints, old Tidno. Lot of nonsense. It's all wrong. We were never Celts. If you asked old Malcolm Gwynedd in 517, or before he died in 547, he would have not recognised the term Celt. The Celts were a tribe down in southern Gaul and in Switzerland, known to the Romans. The Romans wrote about the Celts, and they wrote about a separate people called the Britons. We're the British, and we're the West Britons, never Celts. But these academics, and we're talking, you've heard of Edward Lloyd. You go to Eisteddfod, in the Flyfell, and there's a Cymdeithas Edward Lloyd. They have a tent for him. He's famous because he went to Oxford. And this is talking about 1700, late 17th century, early 18th century. And he was one of those with Elias Ashmole. Anybody here been to Oxford? You've been to the Ashmolean Museum, where King Alfred's jewelers and so forth, and Guy Fawkes' lantern, and Pocahontas' mantle, and all these things. Elias Ashmole, who founded the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the oldest museums in the country or something. He was a great friend of Edward Lloyd, the Welshman. Was he Radnorshire? Anyway, and they decided that we were Celts. And it's only since about 1700 they got this misnomer. People started talking about us as Celts. They got it wrong. So always question. Don't assume. Okay? Well, these clever people who knew what's what were deciding on their dogma, writing their books. And they had come across these standing stones or burial chambers, whatever, in the countryside. And people would say, well, what's that all about? Who put them up? Why? And so Alfred Watkins, the antiquarian and brewer, going around the countryside, using his eyes and using his camera to take pictures, which focused him on the countryside. He was part of them, but standing aside, as it were, because he didn't necessarily subscribe to their dogma. But being a proper person, he would pay due heed to it. But he noticed that these stones all lined up. And he thought, oh, for one thing, this is a Christian country. He lived near the cathedral. He would take tea with the bishop. And also remember, in those days, this was before 1951, when Sir Winston Churchill was Prime Minister again. And Churchill, of course, as you all know, he was a Druid. You all knew Princeton Churchill was a Druid, didn't you? Sorry?
I knew he went to school with Alistair Crowley.
Okay.
Alistair Crowley.
Oh, yeah, Alistair Crowley, yeah, but...
they went to school together, didn't they?
Yeah, a different story. But Druid, I've met people who knew Churchill as a Druid. I knew a man, in 1980 he was 80. In 1940 he was 40. He was one of the pioneering vegans. And he was also Their undercover story was Naturist Club, because they do all the rituals skyclad. And there's a reason why I learned these things. There's power in being naked. Just physical power and being skyclad is part of the thing. And but Churchill expressly commanded the man I met. He may have been called Bingham something, but he they would say a covenant witches. It was a grove of druids in the New Forest during the Battle of Britain in 1940 to raise the cone of power, telling Hitler, go away, do not come. He had all his invasion barges in Rotterdam ready to put his hundreds of thousands of troops on, and suddenly he changed his mind and didn't come. No, I'm going off at a tangent straight away. I'm here to talk about leys. So I'm talking about the Second World War in Churchill. I'm good at that. And later on, we can get, please lead me astray again. Because it's Churchill who won the war. Now, you can talk all you like about the war, and I used to go to A.J.P. Taylor's lectures in Oxford when I was a student. And I'd agree with old Alan Taylor. But it was Churchill. Forget about all the other things. Yes, Stalin, the Yanks and all that. There was only one reason why we won the war and we defeated Hitler. Just let that fact sink in. Hitler lost. Hitler could have won. You could all now be speaking German and hail Hitler to each other. It'd be a very different world. We've been lucky in our lifetimes, have we not? Thanks to people like Churchill, the Druid, and it's because he served the goddess above all, against all other advice, that we won the war, because it was Churchill who sent the troops into the Balkans, into Greece and Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, when everybody said, what a stupid decision. And of course, we did lose 50,000 men and all their materiel. We almost lost North Africa and the Suez Canal at the same time. All because obstinate old Druid Churchill knew he had to do it because the goddess told him so. But if he hadn't have done that, we'd have lost the war. Because Hitler was intending to spring Operation Barbarossa on Stalin that very spring. And then he was distracted by that ruddy old Druid Churchill. And Operation Barbarossa was delayed a crucial 7 weeks. So he didn't invade Russia or the Russian part of Poland until the summer solstice, 22nd of June. Stalin didn't want to know about his so-called friend Hitler invading him. The very night before the German tanks rumbled across that border, Stalin was sending munitions trains the other way to Germany, sending Germany ammunition. Because they were friends, they signed a peace treaty. That's how clued up Stalin was. So Hitler said, thank you very much for the bullets, now we're going to fire at you. And because he did it on the 22nd of June and not on the 1st of May, because of old Churchill buggering things up in the Balkans, he was too late. And by the time he got to the gates of Moscow, it was snowing. And Lady Winter took over. And the Russians were now shivering. The German army was now shivering. They hadn't got the right clothing. And instead of winning the war, which they could easily have done if they'd have started when Hitler wanted to, Stalin was able to recuperate and come back to life, move his factories down the Trans-Siberian Railway, and then eventually return to enter Berlin in 1945, and all the rest is history. But none of that would have happened if it hadn't been for Churchill the Druid in doing the stupid thing of invading Greece where he did, because all his generals would tell him, no, don't do that, it'll be disaster. But he was a Druid and he had a dream, and the goddess told him, this is what you must do. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about the Second World War, am I? I'm here to talk about leys, and that happens to involve Druids. And the reason why I mentioned Churchill was, how did I first mention Churchill? I said when he was Prime Minister the second time in 1951. And what did he do when he was Prime Minister in 1951?
Lifted the ban on Druidism. Right?
No, Druidism was never banned. But, in effect, what you're coming to, he revoked the law on witchcraft. Any witches here? No witches. All these women, they can't want to see your third nipples. Get them out. Well, you ought to be against the law. They were still imprisoning witches during the war, because there was one had a dream about her son. He was on a ship and it got sunk, and he came to her before he when in this country she had a dream of him, and told him he'd been sunk, and she knew the name of the ship, and he said where it was. That was classified information. So they came around and arrested her. How did she know? Well, she's a witch. Oh, we'll get her under the Witchcraft Act. And Druid, and Churchill being a Druid, when he got power again, one of the first things he did was revoke the Witchcraft Act. So that's the only reason why we're a bit freer in this country today than we were before. That Witchcraft Act was still in force, of course, in 1925, when, what was his name? Alfred Watkins, who wrote the Old Straight Track, was living near Hereford Cathedral. And witchcraft includes things like dowsing. So you couldn't say, oh, I dowsed this in those days, because you could be done under the Witchcraft Act. If you read his book, The Old Straight Track, there's not a single mention of the word dowsing. Doesn't mean he didn't dowse. I've met people whose ancestors dowsed with Alfred Watkins, and they've shown me old black and white pictures of them together. But you couldn't write about it. All right? So, going back to the 1920s, this man, Alfred Watkins, in Herefordshire, noticed alignments of sacred sites. And he used the ancient term ley, L-E-Y. So he wrote about leys. And he wrote this book, The Old Straight Track. And in those days, because you were proper and you didn't meddle with spiritual things unless you were an Anglican, we all know that God is made in the image of an Englishman, don't we? That false religion of so-called Christianity, with Jesus never being a Christian, of course, you know that, because it's in the Bible. Paul invented it. The Roman citizen, Saul, the enemy of Jesus. Jesus was a good Druid, we know that. He was 1/4 British. He came here. His mother Mary was the son of Anna of Gwent. And in fact, Mary died here, and she had a hut over in Holy Island, over near the lighthouse on Holy Island, near Holyhead. I've slept in it, dreamt in it. In fact, it was my hut 500 years later. And he was a good Druid, brought up as a Druid, and an Essene, because the Essenes and the Druids were linked. But again, I'm going off on a tangent, so maybe question and answer time. But the point is that Alfred Watkins noticed lines in the landscape. He didn't write about them in spiritual terms. He was a fallen out with his neighbour, possibly broken the law. if he admitted he dowsed anything. He thought of them as ancient trackways, footpaths, roads. And indeed, some are, were used as such, they had multifunctions. Except when you come to a hill, and the sensible thing for a horse and cart, was to go round the hill. These didn't go round the hill, they went straight over the top, the steep way. So they're more than trackways. But he's called his book, he entitled it, The Old Straight Track. Who has read The Old Straight Track by Alfred Watkins? Well, that's where you must start. It's still in print, you certainly get it in the library. The Old Straight Track by Alfred Watkins. You don't need to write it down because I've got a free leaflet for you. And it's all on the back and it tells you it. So you can get the leaflet here before you go. So we had the idea of ancient trackways. And Alfred Watkins thought, because he used to be part of the Woolhope Society, old antiquarian society, respectable society in Hereford. The archaeologists all knew the magazine Antiquity, archaeological magazine, a couple of years after Alfred Watkins' book came out in 1927, this archaeological magazine was started. And Alfred Watkins, in a good, wholehearted, friendly fashion, said, look, here's a review copy of my book and I'd like to pay for an advert, sell my book. Well, it's all about standing stones and things. You think the odd archaeologist or two might be interested. They read his book. Ancient Britons had a system of trackways to the land, all lined up, marked with burial chambers and standing stones and all that. Oh, can't allow that, because we know that in those days they're all thick and stupid, their lives are nasty, brutish and short. It's in their dogma. And they refused his paid advertisement for the book, The Old Straight Track. How broad-minded our academics are, and I come from Oxford. So don't search for enlightenment down that road. It's nothing about education. It's about indoctrination. They tell you what you should think. All right? Anyway, the concept of leys is, of course, because it's eternal. They've always been there before us. It's much, much older than Alfred Watkins. Have you heard of Dr. John Dee? D-double-E? Hands up, you heard of Dr. Dee. And he was Queen, you heard of Queen Elizabeth I? Dr. Dee was Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer. He was a Welsh descent from Lancashire, but he lived over in Mortlake or Putney, one of those boat race places on the Thames. And he wrote a book of mathematical treatises by Dr. John Dee around about 1600. And in there, he writes about invisible lines and immortal beams running through the earth. And the study of these immortal beams and invisible lines was the chiefest science, the greatest of all sciences, most important of all. Read his book, Mathematical Treatises by Dr. John Dee, 1600. And well, there are many other people knew in the old days about leys. You've got the place names lay all over the country. Look at all the places that end in L-E-Y. Burnley, Dudley, Botley, Cowley. There are even places called Ley Hill. And people used to live in the countryside. Before the Industrial Revolution, We were part of the landscape. People just knew it because we were part of the living earth too. We were not separated from it. Oh yeah, the church had done its worst to do that. That's why the word pagan just derives from Latin for country dweller. Church, the Roman church, because it is a Roman invention, no truth in it at all. It's all used to control through fear, power. Gosh, you'd never get any modern politicians today trying to control us through power and fear, surely not. I mean, nobody here would be stupid enough to say, oh, there's a virus, we've got to get vaccinated. Anybody here got vaccinated? You're all sensible. Good. You're in a tiny minority, you know that. Only last Thursday, 2 days ago, I received information from the Vegan Society, which I used to work for. The Vegan Society, the pioneers of my new people were enlightened and think and spiritual. They say used to be, oh, not now. But the figures are that 87% of the people in the Vegan Society were vaccinated during that pretend plague. And vaccines are not vegan. How can they call themselves vegan if they're taking some pork fat or whatever it is in the vaccine? They're liars. But even of those people, 87% were vaccinated. I mean, I live in the bubble where people think like me, and I think, oh, I tell you what the goddess, well, I can tell that the goddess has told me in dreams and card England places. And then you go to that other world, that 80%, 87% world, and you suddenly realize these people don't even know there's a goddess.
Like, what goddess are you?
Sorry?
Is there a certain goddess you're talking about? Or
Oh, my goddess is Rhiannon.
Oh, yes.
Of the White Horse. But I know Ceridwen very well too, and Bridget, and all the goddesses.
So when you talk about the goddess, you mean the collective of goddesses?
Well,
or one in particular?
Ultimately you go to the source.
Yeah.
But my goddess is Rhiannon. There's a reason for it, and if you dream of Carningian, we might come to that later on. I'd better stick to the topic at the moment.
All right, sorry.
But I think anybody here does not understand and even believe in the concept of a goddess, the spirit of the land. That the land is alive.
I'm not familiar with it.
What do you say?
I said I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
So what do you think the land is? Just a bunch of chemicals?
No, of course not.
But scientists do.
I'm not familiar.
Proper conventional people think that's just a bunch of chemicals. It's dead. They don't understand the concept of spirit.
Yeah. No, I think I understand the concept of spirit, but in terms of goddess, I'm not familiar with it. But you don't have to go into it now.
Oh, I expect we will.
You asked the question if there was anybody that wasn't familiar with it.
Yes, I must retrieve the situation. Why did I ask that question? Where was I? We were talking about Dr. John Dee and people living close to the land. So they didn't have to ask this question. It was a stupid thing to do because we know it. He just knew you were part of the land. It was alive. They just knew about leys naturally. But then you had one of the great catastrophes. You had the Industrial Revolution. And nearly all the people had to leave the countryside and go to the towns and the factories and were detached from that living land. Becoming part of the urban culture, which of course the great city of all in the old days is Rome, the centre of all evil, the Antichrist, the Pope, the controller who'll tell you what to do and burn you at the stake if you don't. Is there no history of that? Anyway, we were detached from the spirit of the land. We've forgotten the old ways and things like leys, the idea of a living land, of lines in the land marked by stones. Well, it's all nonsense. Fairy story, even that term, fairy story, contempt for the old. Well, fairies, they're things that don't exist, aren't they? Because people don't believe in fairies. They're only things you read in children's books. I mean, I've seen fairies a few times in Carnegie. If I dare tell anybody, well, I daren't tell them. They immediately say, well, he's a nutcase. What do you do? I was with the fairies last night. They danced next to me. But no one's going to believe that.
I do want to ask you something along the lines.
Sorry?
I do want to ask you something
Yeah.
along the lines of the spirit of the land. Like,
Yeah.
do you believe that the spirit of the land can communicate poetry and like songs?
Oh, through poetry, indeed. It comes out, the messages come out in poetry. That's how it works.
Songs, which are similar to poetry. I mean,
Yeah.
song is just really poetry with voice. So
Someone here bought last copy of a book on Camlan, Arthur's Camlan, the Ballad of Derval Gadon. That's me.
okay.
But it came out, I knew I had to write about it. Well, I didn't know, and I never thought of myself as a poet. But when I came to write about it, it just came out as a ballad in poetry. But I have spent a couple of dozen more nights on top of Cadet Idris, let alone all the other hills. And they do say when you go up Cadet Idris, spend a night in Cadet Idris, well, in the morning you either be mad, dead, or a poet. Well, I'm still alive. As to the other two, you make your own minds up. But yes, poetry does come through it. A message comes through in poetry. So you had us detached from the living land, not even recognizing it, not knowing it, and yet fundamentally, after all, we've all been reincarnated many times, so we know in our own souls, our eternal souls, we do have a concept of the truth somewhere hidden away. It's been beaten out of us by those new schools and by the church and all this fear controlling us to think their way and not to find the hidden truth, the real truth, the truth for the Druids of Greer and Airbnb, truth against the world. That's all it comes down to in the end. Stand up for truth. And then this mechanistic, this industrial culture sprung its own surprises. A great invention of Victorians was the Ordnance Survey map. Didn't have maps in the old days. It's not like that you could rely on. And you had railways. And those people who'd been shunted into Manchester to work in the mills were allowed a Sunday off. And you know, some of them wouldn't go to church. Their worship on a Sunday was to take a train out into the countryside, trespass, no doubt, and you got the rising of things like the Ramblers Association and all this. But it was natural enough to take relaxation in the fresh air of the countryside. We had a yearning for this spirit in the land, even though we're told it doesn't exist. We knew we had to connect with it. And you had these trains allowing us out of those cities back into the countryside. And we had these new maps which enabled us to see where we were going. So we could go out and have a good, efficient 5, 10, 15-mile hike in our precious moments of freedom. And people studied these maps. And they were surprised to see, oh, if you draw a straight line from this standing stone here, and it goes to that holy well there, and it goes on to that church there, ancient, they were all lined up precisely like a gun barrel. Even Colonel Johnson, the director of the Ordnance Survey down in Southampton in the 1890s, recognized this. It was obvious. Nowadays, well, people don't use maps nowadays on their only smartphones. That's no good. You need a proper map. And to look at the whole picture. But nowadays, the proper maps aren't even up to the job because somebody somewhere decided, oh, we won't leave that dot on the map to show us a standing stone, we'll just take it off. They've been doing this without telling us well, since 1990 I first noticed it. I can show examples of my old OS maps which show features marking a ley, and now they're not on the modern maps. The standing stone is still in that field, but it's not marked to the map any longer. They don't want you to know. They learnt their lesson because they put it on the old maps originally, doing an efficient job, and then people like that Ruddy Medley Alfred Watkins wrote his bloody book about it and told people, and they read it. You'll start thinking for yourselves next. You're supposed to be cannon fodder. Do as you're told. You want to get in the spirit, you go to church and you kneel down and you do what the priest says. All right? Well, that's how it's been for 2,000 odd years, isn't it? Nothing to do with Jesus the Druid, who died in Kashmir, not on the ruddy cross. Get your truth out. It says in the Bible he didn't die on that cross. It's obvious. If you died on the cross in Roman days, you were left there at least 4 days to hang and suffer, and if they're kind to you, they'd break your legs so you die more quickly. He was taken down that very same evening. He was drugged before he was put up. It's all there in the Bible. He had a token wound in his side from Longinus' spear, that's all. It was all a put-up job by his cousin Pontius Pilate, who was a fellow Druid who was born in what we now call Scotland at Glenlyon, of the Mingus clan that spelt Menzies. Related to the old Queen Mother from the Glenlyons, Bowes Lyon family. This is real history. They don't want you to know it. Jesus ended up being spirited away on the trade routes which were run by the Jews out to Kashmir, and his grave is in Kashmir. It's called Isa. The Muslims got hold of this. It's in their Quran. He lived to a ripe old age. He had a second wife with more children. His first wife, Mary Morton, came to this country and ended up in Gaul. This is all proper history. Jesus was a Druid. The early followers of Jesus were called followers of the way. The way of Jesus, not Christians. This is the invention of Paul, the Roman, the liar. And the early followers of Jesus in Rome, you'll find their leaders were Britons. Oh, Cradocus, when he got imprisoned there. The palace of the Britons is still there in Rome. That's why they met. They were related to Jesus because Jesus' granny was there, Anna, the Princess of Gwent. He was 1/4 British, brought up as a Druid. And their symbol was a fish for the then new age of Pisces. Not a cross. Not a cross of suffering, torment. Do as you're told, otherwise you'll burn in hell for eternity. Fear, through control through fear. The Roman symbol. This is all nonsense. Nothing to do with just. And I'm getting off on the tangent. We don't. So, sorry, Bishop, we didn't mention that, did we? Right, we'll go back to leys. So, we had maps, new maps, opening people's eyes, access to the countryside, which they'd been detached from, and people were discovering straight lines marked by things like standing stones, crisscrossing throughout the country. And we're at the stage where people thought of them as old trackways. Are you all with me so far? Now, old Alfred Watkins died in 1935. This is a powerful time, strange things happening. One thing, as Alfred Watkins was dying, a lady called Catherine Maltwood was writing a book about the Glastonbury Zodiac. Have you heard of that? Patterns in the landscape, to do with the living landscape again. And a year later, in 1936, another lady, Doreen Valley, pen name was Dion Fortune. I don't remember her real name. Lived on the slopes of Glastonbury Tor above Chalice Fell, where Geoffrey Ash was to live later. Anyway, the lady with a pen name Dion Fortune wrote novels, including one in 1936, published in 1936, called The Goat-Foot God. Goat-Foot God being old Cernunnos, the one who used to have lots of horny nights. No wonder the goddess liked him. And she mentioned there about lines of force, energy, power. Straight lines, marked by standing stones. So she was the first sort of written evidence of the concept of energy, spirit, power, going into the occult, you could say, instead of the conventional, those proper people who go around as ramblers. And I helped found the Ramblers in Wales, so I know what that's how I've been taking everything. You get madmen like me doing the hard work to begin with, and then you get the proper people who've got money and all that, and they come in and they turn it into something completely different. Nice and comfortable. They just want a little walk in the countryside. They don't want to say, why is that there? Or understand what they're doing. But you had then the idea of a spiritual power within the land. And the easiest way for me was a dream and Carning. They told us what stone circus was. I read archaeologists and so on. I was at Oxford when Alexander Thom was Professor of Engineering. Professor of Engineering, not archaeology. All the bright ideas come from people who are not tainted by the dogma of their discipline. They're free thinkers, think for themselves. And old Professor Thom, his fun was to go on a boat around the Hebrides and places like Cardiff, all the old stone circles, and he would measure them and come to conclusions. And he'd find things like they had a unit of measurement which he called the megalithic yard. Megalithic yards, units of measurement, do not conform. We're talking about sort of 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. They do not conform with the proper academic notion that our lives were nasty, brutish, and short, and we had no intelligence then. Therefore, whatever that bloody Scotsman, Tom, is finding is wrong because it could not and did not happen, and I don't want anything else, don't tell me. Nevertheless, Carnish stands, and there is a demonstrable thing called a megalithic yard. They measured. They were intelligent. They were more in tune with the goddess, the spirit of the living land. So you then the Second World War came along. There was a fan club for Alfred Watkins. They called themselves Straight Track Society. They used to go around in their motor cars, another new invention, go around Salisbury Plain and places, Stonehenge, have their pictures taken, and they were following leys on these maps. But they grew old. You had the Second World War, and things died out. And then you had a revival, principally in the 1960s, but there was always someone keeping the flame alive. And what happened after the Second World War? What was in all the newspapers? What was getting people all excited? Think of, say, years, I'd say dates like 1947. I mentioned a place, somewhere like Roswell. What was on the go?
UFOs.
Yeah, flying saucers. That's what all the nutcases were suddenly seeing, flying saucers. Or perhaps they were. Just because it doesn't conform doesn't mean it's not true. I've never seen one, but I've seen lots of other things. I know people who have. They told me. But there was a Frenchman, Aimé Michel. This name Michel, Michael, comes up a lot with leys. And the Dreams Incarnate, the old St. Michael, is featured as well. Michael. Anyway, he wrote a book about leys in France, and he plotted not leys, about flying saucers, UFOs. There's a new word for them, isn't there? They want to confuse us now. A whole string of letters. But let's call them UFOs. And he plotted where they'd been seen, and lo and behold, the sightings were on straight lines. And then other people, including a friend of mine in this country, Philip Heselton, well, they realised these straight lines conformed with leys. And then the notion comes up, Tony Red, Alan Red was his surname, he wrote a book about them in this country, which made people think, showing how UFOs could, and they got messages from where they would have contact, and they were going along the lines of force, as is written about in the Goatfoot God by old Guillaume Fortune. They were energy lines, and they were using the energy, natural energy, the magnetic energy of the Earth, to power their spacecraft, or maybe from a future dimension, or both. But you've got the link between UFOs and leys and energy. And you've got then, well, the two would mix. And then you had another Michel. Have you heard of John Michel? Nobody here not read his book, View Over Atlantis. Before that, 1967, he wrote Flying Saucer Revelation, is it? Well, he was a famous writer. A very self-assured old Etonian. He didn't, he studied Russian. Well, there's a clue, isn't it, at Cambridge? I mean, who would study Russian? What would this country want Russian speakers for? I never spelt out the word SPY, of course, did I? But anyway, strange things happen in this world. But old John Michel wrote about flying saucers, and then he went to a lecture by Jimmy Goddard, who's one of us in the network of lay hunters. Well, John Michel was as well, but he's dead now. Jimmy Goddard revived lay hunting. He and his school friend, 1961, Philip Heselton, they got in touch with the son of Alfred Watkins, and they got his blessing. They started a little magazine called The Lay Hunter, a little rodeoed duplicate thing to begin with. And Jimmy Goddard gave a talk on leys. And John Michel went to that talk. And because of that, John Michel put two and two together, and his next book in 1969 was The View Over Atlantis, republished in 1983 as A New View of Atlantis. And he wrote many more books. One of his best ones in collaboration with a man called Robin Heath, who's still alive, down in Pembrokeshire, not far from Cardigan, and a mathematician. And he's written about Alexander Thom for one thing. But anyway, you've got the idea of leys back into the public consciousness. What are they? Why? Well, they're certainly there. That's undeniable. As long as they don't take the symbols for a standing stone off the OS map, of course. And what's even more perilous for a lay hunter today, a lot of these leys are marked by old churches, a cross for an old church. Christian church, so the lie has been revealed as a lie. And the churches, no, people don't use churches, they don't go, they're sold off in their private homes, which means their little crosses on the OS maps have been deleted. So there's another major lay mark taken off the map, so it's harder for a novice to find a lay. If I want to find a lay, I use the old maps. Very convenient, but it's revealing when you do. And you wonder, why does somebody up there, or sorry, down there in Whitehall or wherever, decide that it would be a good thing if we didn't know about leys? Nothing to do with power, are they? Oh, Dr. D never said that this was the chiefest of scientists, did he? But he did. And they are. Right. And then there was an art student in 1967, Paul Devereux by name, from Leicestershire. Unlike John Michel, he was a working class lad, diligent, very respectful. He wanted people to respect him. John Michel couldn't care less what you thought about him. He was from Eton. He knew he was up there with the gods already. But Paul Devereux was at this art college in Bromley in Kent in 1967. And he and his classmates looked out the window and witnessed a UFO. Now, it's all very well being theoretical, but when you've got a ruddy flying saucer in front of your nose, this becomes undeniable practice. And it changes you. It makes you question. And that led him to Leys. And he became editor of the Lay Hunter magazine in 1977, I think, 76. And he wrote a book. And he was so devoted to Leys, very bravely, so I understand all these perils, because I did a similar thing, he became a full-time, self-employed author of books on Leys. No money to back him up, faith. And as I say, I know what that's like. And he did it, and he wrote a couple of dozen books on Leys. Have you ever read a book by Paul Devereux?
Spell his name, sorry.
Sorry?
How do you spell his name?
You got that leaflet
Oh, it's
at
on
the
there.
bottom,
It's on there, is it?
Paul Devereux.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Okay? And Paul Devereux was revealing Leys to people, and he was editing the Lay Hunter magazine, which people didn't know about. It's an alternative press in those days, no internet. But I happened to come across it in 1978 when I was teaching in Swindon. And there was a sort of New Age society there called Swindon Pulse. They have a monthly speaker, all sorts of things like the batch remedies or organic education, otherwise, all the New Agey things. And I organised a coach trip on a Monday, Bank Holiday Monday, beginning of May 1978, to one of the early festivals of mind, body and spirit at Kensington Olympia. You've heard of the mind, body and spirit. But this is in the old days when it was proper people full of spirit, not now like when it's been taken over by all the commercial people who just want your money. Which I'm afraid that is the way of things, is what it's like. But anyway, I organised this coach trip, went there, and there was a stall for the Lay Hunter. Oh, I signed up immediately. Just like you're going to sum up to my stall today and sign up with me. All right? And well, a year later, I was writing for the Lay Hunter magazine, and it was my turn to find a speaker in Swindon Pulse, the monthly meetings, a bit like us today, same number. And about 20 would turn up every month. And I got Paul Devereux to come. It was January 1979, I think it was January, might have been February, this time of year. And I wanted to, we had an outside speaker, expenses, you had to pay his petrol money. He only charged us a tenner, by the way. And he was coming from, well, near London at the time. He moved up to Sandbuston later on, and he moved all around. He down in Gloucestershire, Morton and Marsh at the moment. But anyway, I wanted to have a good show, justify him coming. And I was in Wiltshire near Avebury, and I organised publicity in the local press. Went down and took lots of photos of me in the standing stones and my dowsing rods, and had a really good splurge to promote this talk. Only time in my life that week, there was a local newspaper strike. And it didn't get in the paper. It did the next week after the event. Too late to promote it. It's what happened. There were two teams on this pitch. We're playing for the goddess, but you know the other lot are there. When you're doing something big, they bring up their big guns too. Okay, I'm a Rangers supporter. You're Celtic. Bring them on. We beat you 3-0 last time. But that's what happened. I was desperate. I went around knocking on doors, anybody I could think of. Hours before the talk. Wow. It was amazing. Paul Devereux remembers it to this day. It was just the atmosphere. And it was held in my classroom, in my school. Got it all for free. I had the chairs and the desks all at the back, around the sides of the class. And the chairs there for people to sit on. So there's what? I had a class of 46, I remember. I was teaching 4C. Yeah, nowadays, they think they're numbered if they got 30. I had 46! 4C! Yeah, right. That's a different story. And they didn't have smartphones to play with either. Anyway, 90 people turned up. They were standing at the back and squatting on the floor in front of me. It was like the Black Hole of Calcutta. The atmosphere is intense. Paul Devereux and I'd never had anything like it. I don't know where they all came from because the publicity was a week late, too late. There was something going on in the late 70s. This splurge of enthusiasm, particularly for leys. It happens. If you had 90, 100 people in this room now, except my classroom is only quarter the size of this room. Can you imagine that? They were keen. That same year I went by first lay hunters moot in Glastonbury. There were 250 there. Now I run the network of lay hunters. We hold moots twice a year. We have our record attendance for one of our moots, we started in 2011, is exactly 100. At Wells Town Hall, not far from Glastonbury. Now we were pleased with 100. But in Glastonbury in 1979, it was 250. There was something in the air or the water or something. Now, well, they've got their 4 and 5G out, haven't they? They've got you all well controlled. You're not allowed to think anymore. Oh, forget about that nonsense about leys. Go down there. Go and watch the telly instead. But it happened. And we had a splurge of books, people like me walking the countryside telling you about leys, showing you, asking questions. There's to do with spirit. The land is alive. And it's the leys and study of them, which is the chiefest science, because the people who rule us know that. Where did they plonk their castles and their cathedrals? On the ancient sacred sites where the leys radiate their power throughout the land. They wish to exploit it and use it to control you. And instead of tapping in naturally to the living land, the goddess, and serving the goddess. Different notion. That's why this world's in the state it's in. And rather interestingly, Paul Devereux, the chief lay hunter in the world, ended up going all around the world, writing about everywhere, was the one who wanted respectability, who wouldn't be seen. I've never seen Paul Devereux Dow's. He wanted to be the sane and sensible face of lay hunting. The man who'd never been to Oxford University or anything like that, like I had or John Michel had. They're very good at dangling little tempting treats in front of you under your nose. And you found he was looking for academic scientific credibility, a thing called the Dragon Project, where he'd measure. Their idea of that was I'd go and dream there and douse there. Their idea is I had to go and Paul help me a couple of times. You had a Geiger counter. Oh, it sickened me near the thing. It was hitting my third eye. They didn't seem to recognize that. There were scientists measuring background radiation and so forth. Well, they did it their way. But they were trying to, well, they weren't studying leys. They were not serving the goddess. Their idea was to control the concept, to twist it to their way of thinking so that you would do as you're told, and they would give you what to think. They called it, and Don Robbins, professor at London University, was head of it. And then, we see, I would be up a Holy Hill. I'd actually be on the spot. I'd be dreaming in the navel of the landscape goddess, and the goddess would come in the dreams. And hundreds of people dreaming. I've been there for thousands of nights doing this. 1 year for 200 nights in a year. And so I knew the goddess. And I could walk the leys. It's natural. Our forebears knew it. But Paul Devereux came up once for Sky TV, Discovery Channel. But when we would meet, a couple of times a year, he would be with these academics from America. And they would offer him, a chair of consciousness studies. Yes, you, little Paul Devereux from Leicestershire, working class lad, you could become a professor at a university, and here's the grant money. And the dreams, he would ask me to tape record, and I used to do it. Goddess does not like tape recording. I stopped doing that because the goddess said, no more of that. You throw that ruddy tape recorder away, along with your computer and everything else. Although I never had a computer. I turned 2 away from 2 publishers over the years for free. But the dreams that I tape recorded for Paul Devereux as part of this Dragon Project in Carnegie England were sent to a certain Dr. Stanley Krippner in, I think it was California University or something, in America. Well, you can read about Dr. Stanley Krippner in other books. Is there one called something to do with goats, staring at goats or something? Dr. Stanley Krippner was the CIA. They wanted to control this thing. They worked with the Russians on it even. They were doing things like going out of the body, going out of the body. They were training spies to go up and float in the ceiling and the room in the Kremlin to, of course, I suppose they'd have to be Russian-speaking spies, John Michel, and they would be able to come back after their remote viewing and tell the Pentagon exactly what the Russians are up to. Oh yes, this goes on. I could furnish plenty of details. But they knew all about leys, and one thing they decided was that Joe Bloggs in the street isn't going to know about leys. Because Paul Devereux, the great lay hunter, came back from America, having divorced his British wife and having a new American wife, who had the pots of money. And I didn't want to know it. He's my friend. But 2 people came to me and said, look at this is a stock exchange. I mean, these are all the £50,000 worth of Coca-Cola shares and all this in the name of Charlotte Devereux, Paul's wife. Now, this is what they do. They took him out. They turned him. You want to destroy an uncomfortable movement like lay hunting, you take the head of the snake, as it were, and you chop it off. That's their policy. And by 1996, when Paul Devereux eventually resigned as editor, before he was going around telling us, lay hunters at our moots, there is no such thing as a lay. You must stop believing it. It's all nonsense. You're not seeing things right. And he was especially against dowsing. Dowsing, and I could agree with them because I've met dowsers and I've been with them. And some of them, would you believe that people who douse might have big egos and think they know it all? Oh yeah, you can't tell me anything because I've doused this, therefore it must be right. They haven't got a clue what they're on about. And so when Paul Devereux stood up at a lay hunter's moot and railed against, and I quote his words, the tyranny of the dowsing rod. Because you didn't have to think to follow a dowsing rod, you just had to hold the rod and go where the rod told you to go. And then you said, oh, this is a lay. Well, you don't know what you're doing, mate. And Paul Devereux, who I'd never seen douse, was all against that. In 1927, I've already told you, the archaeological magazine Antiquity denied Alfred Watkins his paid advert in their magazine for his book, The Old Straight Track. Hence the existing divide between archaeologists and lay hunters. We're all interested in the same thing, are we not? Standing stones, burial chambers. But they're proper. Would you think for one moment the likes of me are entirely improper? But actually, I've never drunk beer in my life. I've never got drunk archaeologists. I know you do. I've seen you when you're drunk. Anyway, that was the split between lay hunting and archaeology in 1927. Refused the advert for the book, Old Straight Track. Paul Devereux did the same thing in 1989. This is just after, well, he married Charlotte way back in 1984, I think. But they identified him, and he used to spend 6 months a year in America, and they were bribing him, both with money and with respectability, with academic posts, scholarships, so forth. So they can do what they say. And Paul Devereux in 1989 was editor of the Lay Hunter. Everything's hunky-dory. Our moot was in Gloucester that summer. And I remember on the coach trip, because I was sitting next to John Michel, who wrote The View of Atlantis. And he said to me, Lawrence, something's gone wrong with Paul, because I know this man called Hamish Miller. Anybody here know Hamish Miller? Dowser. Dead now, died on the 25th of January 2010. So I was living just 6 weeks before, 7 weeks before. We were dowsing at St Michael's Mount on the Michael line. Anyway, good bloke, Hamish Miller, as you know. And he'd written a book with Paul Broadhurst called The Sun and the Serpent, about a great lay. And here I'm going to come on, I can start giving you all sorts of examples of lays, all with stories like the songline of Thayfal Govies, you heard of him. Fourth branch of the Mabinogi, been to Bryn Cadavana above Harlech. Well, that's a good example of a lay. I'll come to that in a minute. If I don't, please shout out to me, Jovan. Remember Thayfal Govies, right? So I don't forget to bring that in. But I can start giving you sound examples of lays so you can identify with them. They're everywhere, of course, especially here, Canada. So I was sitting next to John Michel in 1989, and he said to me, well, Lawrence, do you know about Hamish Miller? I hadn't heard of him then. And Paul Broadhurst, they've written this book, following the Michael line, a great lay running from Cornwall to Norfolk through the extreme breadth of Britain. You couldn't find a greater breadth if you get the atlas out. From near Land's End at Carnley Boyle to Hopton-on-Sea, just inside Norfolk over the border from Suffolk. And it goes through a whole string of significant sites, including Glastonbury Tor, Avebury Stone Circle, Bury St Edmunds, and so forth. Get the picture? Undoubtedly a major lay. And it was at the angle of 63 degrees, which is Beelter, that's the 1st of May, sunrise. And John Michel wrote about this in 1969 in The View of Atlantis. But I knew about it because I'd been told about it when I was little. Because my family used to go on cycle rides in the Whitnham Clumps, Clifton Hampden. Whitnham Clumps being a landscape goddess. Isis overlooking the confluence of the River Tame and Isis at Dorchester upon Thames in Oxfordshire. Where Cunigils, the king there, was baptized. And was it? Yeah, Cunigil, I'm trying to remember the saint, so-called saint who baptized him. But anyway, it's a very significant spot where the Tame and Isis doth embrace and kiss and join the one to be called Thamesis, River Thames. So the landscape goddess could have been Isis. But I've only dreamt in her belly. No, I dreamt in her breast. Nice place to dream. Yes.